and welcome to the latest in the Payne Institute's summer webinar series. My name is Brad Handler. I'm the program manager for the Sustainable Finance Lab here at Payne. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Dan Arthur, who is the president and a co-founder of ALL Consulting. ALL is an engineering, environmental, and technical services firm focused on the oil and gas upstream and midstream. Dan will address the landscape of plugging and abandoning orphaned and idle wells here in the U.S., including the nascent use of carbon markets and other carbon finance as sources of financing. Prior to founding ALL, Dan served as a VP of Upstream Energy Services at a large international consulting engineering firm. He was an enforcement officer and national expert for the U.S. EPA, a drilling and operations engineer with an independent oil producer, and he worked for oilfield service company Halliburton. Our webinar will work as follows. Dan's going to speak to us all for 30 to 40 minutes. I will then run through questions of my own, as well as curating questions from any of you. And in that vein, I ask that you send any questions directly to me in the chat function. And like I said, I will kind of organize and curate, etc. This webinar is being recorded. The finished product should be ready in about a week, and we can send that out to you. And with that, thanks, Dan, so much for joining us today. Really look forward to this conversation, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Let me share my screen and we will get moving. Okay. All right. Well, I'm not sure how many of you here have heard me talk before. I've done this a time or two, but I wanted to get into some things that are really in the highlight right now. I know back in 2011, I was part of a national group, the National Petroleum Council, looking at well plugging and abandonment back then, and it's come a long way. So I might have to deal with my dog a little bit there, but we'll go through that. So this is the abstract, and I'd say that part of what we're going to try to address, and it's a broad subject, is a really broad variety of wells that need plugging and issues that come along with that plugging, and now a way to try to deal with some of these issues is this private sector carbon market, which I would say is instrumental and will be if we're ever going to get all these wells plugged. So if we look just at a very basic thing with the first year funding to the states from, the IIJA, states got $25 million apiece. In that first year, we've plugged 6,000 wells. And the states have been doing this for years. But nonetheless, with 3.5 million idle and orphan wells out there, we've got to figure out how to step things up. So if we look at, just looking at this through history, what you see when you really start digging into this over time is that historically wells were abandoned, plugged, using whatever methods were appropriate at the time, and regulations and standards. So if you look at some of the historical documentation out there, in 1922, the industry standard of published books was to plug with a 2-foot wooden plug and so forth. So things have changed a lot. And what I would say is really happening now is that with the focus on this, we're seeing so much done to develop new technologies, new materials, new procedures. People have a much better idea of what they're doing, and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But when you look at a picture like this, which is, Southern California, back in the day, things have changed just a tad. And then you got to ask yourself, so we've been plugging wells for a while, right? But historically, the addressing methane hasn't necessarily been the priority, right? And when you think about it, what's the big deal? Why are we worrying about it, and so forth? Well, in the realm of of climate change and the climate market and what's happening there, methane over a 20-year period is, I'd say, 84 to 87 times more harmful to the climate than CO2. And I would also say that according to the UN, methane has accounted for about 30% of climate change since pre-industrial times. So there's some pretty good statistics on there that methane certainly is an issue. It's not necessarily a directly harmful to human. You know, if you sniff a little methane, I've been around wells my whole life, and I suppose I'm a little goofy, and maybe that's why. But it's really a lot of those other impacts that it can have. I've done a lot of expert witness testimony on people that have been injured or burned or even, you know, had fatalities due to fires and blowouts and all that. And methane is just one of those things. And with about 3.5 million, we've got a chore ahead of us. And I will say I tried to include some pictures here. This is an old orphan well from the Osage Indian Nation here in Oklahoma, and you know, they all aren't leaking methane, but many of them have issues. They're around people in urban areas and so forth. So we've got a lot to consider. And now we look at the problem. So these are real pictures, but from a basic perspective, you know, air quality can be an issue. Methane is combustible, as these pictures are showing. I can't tell you how many times I've had to go up to welders and explain to them that methane, you know, can catch on fire, and maybe you should do things a little differently. So there's occupational risks that the people working around this. We've got to look at methane mitigations, because in some cases, methane can migrate from sources to get into groundwater and enter buildings. You know, if you're from Appalachia and have seen not just in old orphan wells, but, you know, methane gas migration investigations where gas from pipelines or gas storage facilities or new well drilling or shallow zones that are, you know, that are migrating from one zone up into a groundwater zone and then through that aquifer into somebody's water well and into their house, it can be an issue. So many of the water wells for a century in Appalachia have had vents to allow the methane to vent, and a lot of that was even naturally occurring. So it's still an issue. And then we have all these indirect effects, and I'll let you guys look at that, but nonetheless, it's something that in my experience, what I see is, you know, really it's had more of a focus in the last 20 years with hydraulic fracturing and, you know, the movie Gasland and all sorts of different things, but it's certainly a real issue. And this is just one example. This is in the Tulsa area, where in 1954 a community was built, turned out to be over an old gas field. We had a school also built over that gas field that then was called the Eisenhower School, and a homeowner had to evacuate his house because it filled with methane gas, and they were afraid of exploding. They wound up, you know, plugging the well, coming out. So they wound up using a whipstock to get to the well, but then when they approached the well, got down to 120 feet, they started producing oil because there was oil there as well. And so they plugged the well from 120 feet to surface. So they did kind of a surface plug on it, which isn't great, but at least it stopped the gas. And the other wells that were under, like the school parking lot and so forth, they were able to plug those in a more traditional way. But, you know, these are wells that, you know, behaved for probably 20 years, and then all of a sudden started building up pressure within that reservoir and causing a real problem that certainly had the potential to kill someone. And when we look at, you know, the issue of, you know, are there wells? How many are there? You know, if we look at what the various states and DOI and USGS and all that have is documented, orphan wells, the number is relatively small, a couple 100,000. When you look at idle wells, not idle, non-producing wells, it's even more. And this map in the upper left, this is kind of the Tulsa area. So one of the things that, I get it, I'm a weirdo. I take my kids out, on the weekend, and we go look for old orphan wells in the river or out on the reservation or out in some of these older areas, maybe, the Creek Reservation, Osage, wherever. And we find a lot of undocumented wells. I have one on my property that's just south of Tulsa. But what I would say is that from the historic maps that I've been able to get from like pre-1920, even pre-70, I'm going to say that on the wells on those maps, anywhere from 40 to 70% of the wells are not documented. And this is just another example. So this is the Arkansas River. Tulsa's over here. When you start looking through history, you see a number of instances where there were blowouts and different things happening. One of the other things we had happen in Oklahoma is we had all these dams put in. So we've got, they say we've got more shoreline than Minnesota, and the challenge of that is when those dams were put in, that was kind of after the early development. So we've got thousands and thousands of wells under water lines in various lakes here in Oklahoma. And if you look at, this is Keystone Lake here, this is just a few, but we've got wells out in the river and, under streets leading to the airport and all sorts of different things. So I'm just saying this is a real thing. And when you look at all those dots, those are all wells. The other thing that can happen that I would say is certainly an ongoing thing with not only all the state and federal regulatory agencies, but also significant in the carbon market, is these kind of co-benefits of plugging wells. So this map here is a public school here in Oklahoma. The gray shows that it's a disadvantaged community, and all those green dots are wells and little black squares are schools. So this is Kellyville, Oklahoma. There's 275 idle and orphan wells within 2 miles of 4 schools. And so this is not insignificant when you think of the, just in my mind, what can happen, what has happened. It's not an insignificant thing to think about. So is methane the only problem? I'll just say all these pictures are real pictures. This picture here is a well on my property. This is one down in Lake Texoma. This spill here is, that's New Mexico. This is my stepson with one of the wells in the Arkansas River. This is downtown Oklahoma City. This is, West Texas, and then wells, in urban and rural communities. So you got to think when the Drake well was drilled, we had about a little less than 1 billion people on Earth. And now we have 8 billion. So we've had a lot of urban encroachment throughout the world over some of these old areas. The other thing, these pictures are from a 1971 document called the Tulsa's Physical Environment. And you could see what they did even there, because, we used to dispose of produced water in pits, and you could see things, just things happen and how we could contaminate groundwater or plugs that maybe didn't completely cover a brine zone or whatever. So it's really hard to think about, how technology has evolved, how our industry has evolved, and so forth. So, things have gotten, I would just say, it's incredibly better for what we can do now. But there's still, as you can see, a lot of things that want to tell us we want to address this issue. And then what are those issues? What are the available issues? Well, there's several. Okay. But what we're going to talk about today is, carbon credits and in the private sector carbon market. Some of these that you've probably heard of, the American Carbon Registry or ACR, B Carbon, Carbon Path, there's 06, International Carbon Registry, and so forth. So there's a number of opportunities for this and for different reasonings and so forth, and both carbon offsets and carbon insets. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we want to get into what some of the details of this market actually are. So first, a carbon credit, what the heck are they? They're a tradable certificate or a permit representing a reduction, removal, or avoidance. And that's significant because for buyers or traders, they will look at things, is this a reduction credit, a removal credit, or an avoidance credit? And it's, you get 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide is equivalent to a 1 carbon credit. And I will say that in the well plugging business, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, it's really a little unique in some ways, because this isn't like you have a smokestack that you could just turn off, or you could capture the methane and keep going. These are wells that are all over. Many of them are emitting methane in an uncontrolled way. And by plugging these wells and getting to the carbon market, we can go through a process where left unaddressed, this methane is going to continue, going out and being a problem. And now we can plug it. We can cause an instantaneous impact, and that is permanent. That we can qualify, we can quantify, we can verify all the things. It's very positive. But you guys have probably seen some of these different issues. I'm not going to go into every point, but things like co-benefits, I think, are significant. Traceability, looking at that market value, verification is just super critical. And looking at those different registries, because as I noted, even with showing you that slide with the different registries, each registry's protocol may apply to different types of wells or well situations. So as I noted, this well plugging for carbon credit, there's a ton of them. We've got to look at what that methane is, particularly in the older wells, but I'll tell you, some of the biggest emitters that we've seen have been probably wells drilled after 1950 or 60, and some that are pretty incredible drilled, say, 1980 or after. So there's a lot of different things that we've got to look at. And this is just some of the details and again, some of the protocols that are out there for those different carbon registries. So this is one of the things that is, Brad and I were talking a little bit about this before the call, but there's a number of organizations out there that have just really popped up. I think because some of the challenges and concerns over carbon credits, and can I trust them? Do I know this? Whether it's, nature-based credits or credits industrial-based, or, methane capture removal. So the ICVCM came up with these core carbon principles, and I think these are very good. And you should look at these as you get into this industry. There are other ratings industries out there, ratings organizations, B0 and many others. And I would just say that one of the challenges that I've seen is a lot of those organizations have trouble really understanding this well plugging for carbon credit situation. So we're doing an application right now to the UN compliance market, and all of their applications are set up for really things that are more nature-based or carbon capture sorts of things. So this has been a learning experience for the UN on the work that we're doing there. So let's look at it at some examples. And by the way, this is Tulsa, Oklahoma. So the one I'm going to go through is B carbon, and I've got a few things in here that are probably pretty similar amongst all the registries. So, this process that you go through, you've got to have a project developer, because a well operator cannot get carbon credits. So if it's an idle well, for instance, that well operator can't do that. If it's an orphan well, you've got to have a project developer that takes that well on, essentially acts as an operator, but they're acquiring the well for the sole purpose of plugging for carbon credits. So you've got this project developer, and he does an initial application. Then you get, verification, validation from a third party. You plug the well, then you go through and you do a final plan, and and you submit that in, and it goes through, third party validation again to assure that it's been plugged, and that you did post monitoring to assure that you've addressed methane emissions. For B carbon, you get 80% of the credits at that point. And then 1 year after, you go back and further confirm that the plugged well is not leaking. And I will tell you that with the buyers, with the traders, and especially with the UN, this right here is huge. They want to see some longer term thing. I've seen folks like Well Done Foundation on some of the wells they're plugging, where they'll go back, multiple times. But in the B carbon one, I do like this, that, you have to go back a year later, assure that, and then you get your final 20% of your credits. So the calculation process with B carbon, it's a little different, and I would say all the registries have a different path that they've taken. With B carbon, it applies to either orphan or idle wells. So however you want to refer to idle, abandoned idle, or whatever, but so orphan doesn't have an operator, idle, non-producing well that does. And you go through with B carbon, and it's essentially a decline curve analysis type protocol. So this is, I would say, largely SEC compliant with processes used there and used common in the oil and gas industry. From there, they have a leak rate model that we utilize, and that gets you your total for 20 years of what they allow. You calculate those project emissions, you adjust for uncertainties, you get the net emissions, and that's what ultimately you get your carbon credits issued for. So if we look at this just in a process time frame, you confirm eligibility. So we've got to make sure that that we have additionality addressed. So you're not dealing with a well that the operator has to plug it anyway, or it's going to get plugged, or you're not using federal funds to plug it. I know there's concerns in some areas, like if you're on BLM land. So there's a bunch of stuff that you have to do just to look at a lot of those things, legal statuses and so forth, and then go through and do that decline curve analysis and the leak rate model, and then do all the things, as well as confirming that the site has been remediated after plugging, and going through all that process with what I mentioned before of plugging and assuring, and then 1 year after, and so forth. So in this one example that I'm giving, and is you look at what we had at this one particular well that we plugged, and this is one that we've already submitted to B carbon, and using it as an example. But you come up with a 20-year volume leak, post P&A, and you come up with 11,000 tons. So that's over that baseline emission of what you get. And this is the well on my property, but I know that's another one in Texas. Steve Helmer did that one. This is out at my property. We did a training. But anyway, you go through that net, the net emission reductions, because you've got, your baseline emissions, and then you got project emissions. So the trucks that you take out there, if you're whatever testing and all that stuff that you do, you adjust for it. And then you have an uncertainty factor that B carbon utilizes of 5%. So you come up with, let's start out with a little over 11,000 tons. You adjust for the project emissions, the uncertainty, and you come up with, for this particular well, almost 11,000 tons. So that's one well. 11,000 tons isn't going to make anybody a millionaire, but it's results like this that can hopefully get you to the point where you can help plug, restore, uh, problem wells, leaking wells, and provide some incentive to that project developer and landowner and operator maybe to get this addressed. So I will say that one of the things that I've spent a lot of time and effort doing over these last couple of years is talking with a lot of people just about the quality of these credits, that you're looking at relative to plugging both idle and orphan wells. And there's, registries like, 06 that will plug fields or, leases or something that are economically viable and plug all that, put like a conservation easement on it so it can no longer be produced. So this is a little different than that, but for these, I would say that you have clear additionality, and I know that this gets questioned by a lot of people. I've got a call Thursday morning with Adam Peltz to talk to him about this. I will tell you that there is in today's time, there's a lot of folks out there that just do not like the oil and gas industry. But if you look at orphan wells, I would say that in talking to the buyers and traders, I would say that's a hot commodity in this over some of the idle wells. But I think we're making a lot of progress in that realm. If you look at, just as an example, and one of the things that I look at here is most of the idle wells that are out there, and even marginal production, is small independent operators. I had a call 2 weeks ago from a family in Ohio, and their dad owned 6 wells in Ohio. He was 89 years old in poor health, and the state saying you got to plug those wells. And they called me to ask if I could help them so their dad wouldn't lose his farm. So there's some significant things here. So we have to realize that, in the commodities industry, which is oil and gas, we have to deal with a lot of different things. All sorts of things with prices. And I survived 1982 when Kent Square Bank went bankrupt. During COVID, we had oil prices of minus $47 a barrel. So I mean, there's been a lot of issues that cause people to go bankrupt, out of business. And so it's something that we have to be cautious of. And that's not to say that people don't have responsibilities and all that kind of stuff, but some of these things, and just one last example, and then I'll move on to these other things. But what I've seen in some cases where, small independent operators may have, say, 50 producing wells, and then they may have 500 idle wells. Maybe a bunch of those wells were initially developed by a family member, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And moreover, it's the state's responsibility to protect those resources. So one of the individuals I was working with and took out with me on an NPR interview a couple of months ago, Scott Rabinowitz, he's got an old field that was discovered in 1905. He had a bunch of wells that were idled for decades, went back, recompleted them using short radius horizontal drilling, just out 100 feet. So far, he's turned 65 wells that were of no value to produce 20 barrels of oil a day. So you've got to look at those at a lot of different things. It's not as easy as everybody thinks, but we've got a lot of these wells with a lot of small operators that will never plug these wells. And so if we push too hard, these idle wells are just going to become orphans, and we don't want that to happen. So that whole, the increased regulatory requirements or taxes or whatever is a challenge. So EPA came out with a methane rule, but based on the attorneys I've talked to and so forth, it doesn't apply to idle or even producing inactive wells. So orphans, idle wells. And states will have an opportunity in their state implementation plan to help address that. But I would say, a lot going on there, and as well as lawsuits from states back to EPA on that. Nonetheless, if we look at this well plugging for carbon credits, one of the nice thing about it with B carbons or really any of the protocols is you have an item with these wells that are measurable, quantifiable. I really like the B carbon methodology because it's a very data intensive protocol. So I'm using decline curve analysis. I'm pulling historical production. I'm looking at the stuff that's happened now. I'm going out to the site before and afterwards, collecting emission data. There's a lot of details that are very positive. And these things are right here, as opposed to us talking about trees in the Amazon rainforest. It's a very different thing. It also allows for that immediate elimination of uncontrolled emissions that I was talking about before. So the longer we put off doing these things, the more that methane is going to just keep going up into the atmosphere. So if we're serious about getting to this 1.5, like with the Paris Agreement and so forth, we need to move on from this. We've got also verifiable emissions, not only with B carbon, but I really think with all of them. Permanence is an issue. So we have a lot of people with zombie wells, with all sorts of issues that have happened. But what I'm going to tell you, if you look at the equipment that we have out there and methane monitoring, the new materials that we have and cementing materials and like TS Nano and just all sorts of different things, we've gotten significantly better. I will also say that in spending time with a number of individuals from state and federal regulatory agencies, they've got so much better of a handle on assuring that those wells are plugged better. We've got more people that are focusing on this and doing things that we can make sure that these wells, when they're plugged, that it's permanent. And there are significant co-benefits, like I mentioned with people. If you want to go look in the LA basin and just the density of stuff there, or downtown Fort Worth with the Barnett Shale development in that region, or so many areas, Cleveland, Ohio, and so forth. So this is really neat stuff. And as opposed to it being, like I said, the Amazon rainforest, it's right here. So if you're, say, a developer or a buyer or a trader, and you want to do stuff to, say, do carbon insets on LNG exports, so that when that LNG arrives at its final destination, it's carbon neutral, you can choose to address things in your region of the Gulf Coast. And believe me, there's a lot of wells there. So my last slide, and I think I've about made Brad's time frame here, but this is me. I'm into doing a lot of different things right now with different companies. But this has got my email, my cell. If you guys need anything, got questions, I'm just very happy to talk. And so with that, Brad, I'll throw it back on you.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan. That was a great overview. And I certainly wholeheartedly agree with the core premise that the scale of the problem is just too great to handle from a government funding perspective for what's in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that the attributes of this activity really fit nicely with the core carbon principle idea that's been advocated now and is developing, et cetera. So again, thanks. That's just a great overview. I do have some questions for you. You know that. I also, again, turn to our audience, and please direct message me with some questions, and I'm happy to curate and organize those. And I'm sure we can get to a lot of questions here in the time remaining. So I guess in a broad way, and maybe there's some follow-ups, I'd love for you to comment on the idea that there are developers now that have been chipping away at this for a little while, because B Carbon and ACR and others have published protocols, methodologies to give the roadmap for how to proceed. And so there are entrepreneurs that are trying to do this. So I know you advise many of them and you're in and around the field a lot. So perhaps you can comment on what these folks are finding. And in a sense, what's working well with the methodologies, but then also maybe you can hint at some things that might not work so well, or under what circumstances do they work better than others?
I'll say this on a general basis. Um, what you know, and this is really, I'm going to say this is unfortunate in some ways, because every oil and gas well that's out there, every orphan well, every idle oil and gas well, they all don't fit into this carbon credit box. Some of them just aren't leaking a significant amount to justify the cost and expense of all this. So what I would say that, and I'm gonna say this, but I think everybody knows this, is what people are really trying to do is do their best to kind of cherry pick the best wells. So the high emitters that aren't that expensive to plug, that aren't in some located in somewhere like in the middle of the woods where it's going to cost you $100,000 just to build access to it. So you've got a lot of different things that you have to consider. I will say that what we've seen is from some of the developers is where there was an initial look, a lot of effort looking in Appalachia. There's still work being done there, but expensive to plug. They're not issuing as much gas, so you have more people moving west. So for instance, Zafiro is they're doing their first wells west of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, in kind of gas country. And we've seen that same thing with folks like Rebellion and Grenian, and the even the work that we're doing. Our first with 110 Capital, our first well was in the Barnett Shale area in North Texas. So there's I would say a focus on looking at those areas of high gas, Latimer County, Oklahoma. I mean, there's a number of places in a lot of states, but you've got to look at what those issues are. So for instance, I had a special done on the news channel here looking at all these wells in the Arkansas River, right? A stone's throw outside of Tulsa, or actually within Tulsa, but from downtown. And we had wells that were purging oil, that were bubbling gas. But the challenge is you want to go plug on the Arkansas River, it might cost you $200,000-$300,000. And if you're only going to say earn $10,000 in carbon credits for it, that's pretty tough. So I would say that one of the things that we've seen is if you look at say a really a decent well, break-even points on value for a decent well is probably in the $8 to $10 a ton range. So that's kind of the spot that you're looking at to break even. So you have developers, looking to get, more than that so that there's incentives out there. So those are, I would say, some of the challenges that people are learning what's there, what kind of things are there, and going and moving forward. I would say the other thing that I'll note is you have a number of wells in different places, maybe Indiana, Illinois basin, and other places that may have a significant amount of pressure on them, but maybe they don't have production records or production history, or they're missing information. So you've got work to do to go, well, how do I address that? I don't have that production history. Can I go get it? Can I go to collect tax records or gas pipeline data or some of those other things to help me do that, or to find, to pull in a geologist to help me figure out where a well that I'm interested in is at, and how I might deal with that. So I would say there's a lot of challenges. We are just getting into it. we're still in the Wild West, Brad, but
I understand. Maybe for maybe for my own purposes and maybe for the audience's purposes, I guess what I'll do is I'll try to list what I think some of the things you just mentioned. So there are some wells, you talked about some Appalachian wells, I think, where the methane leakage rate wasn't high enough to support the activity.
mm-hmm.
There were then conditions where the cost to plug in higher emissions conditions was still too great relative to the emissions levels that could be detected. And so those were not as eligible for activities. You talk about production history, and I know the B carbon registry particularly relies on production history. Maybe we'll come back to that a little bit. Can you relate production history with the measurement that happens with within the process? Do those have to match, or how do you deal with that, or how do you deal with it's a capped well in some cases, and so it's probably only leaking some of its potential flow? Maybe you can speak to some of the challenges around that and integrate measurement into the process.
I'll tell you that's a challenge, and I would say that that's one of the things that we're looking at on some, especially the orphans, where you don't have that production history, or even if you do have a production history, it's not being considered. So, one of the challenges is if you go up and measure the emissions, or do you go up and measure just the emissions of leakage of a well? Do you open a valve? Do you not open a valve? I took a group of about 20 people up to an orphan well I have on a property I own, and we had Sean Epps out there and had my equipment, my guys, and when we pulled up our OGI camera, we had gas leaking from threads, from valves, but also coming up from the ground. This is a challenge. And then when you do that short-term measurement, a couple hours, what's your basis to know that that's real, that's all you have? So, in ACR, for instance, you're using a flat rate. Other ones you're using a decline. And, in other areas we have situations where maybe you have a well that has production history, for its main formation, but maybe it has, like we've seen come across wells that have 2,000 or 3,000 psi on the annular space because they had another formation, maybe an unconventional zone that had that too. So like we've been building a skid to do long-term monitoring to have some idea that was, better than just say measuring, gas emissions while you're blowing things down. And then you got to consider safety and flares, and there's a lot, Brad.
I have gathered that there's a lot, right? Right. So it's not as simple as just open up the valve and see what happens, right? For a couple of reasons. First, there's built up pressure. Second, you have the safety concerns around the actual testing process and all of that. Not to mention there are some of these things are hydrogen sulfide, right? It's not as simple as just open the valves and see what happens.
I'll throw something else in here that we often tend to forget, and I've had to run into it, but in some areas of the country, the early, oil and gas development, there was no gas pipelines, there was no place to take the gas, so they just didn't care. They would leave the annular spaces open so it would vent. They were just after the oil. And yet, and so they were just trying to like keep the gas from being a problem. But you get places like the LA Basin or, places, Pennsylvania, all over the country where we've got, formations that had, say, depleted oil and gas production, over the years, but the oil production, but the gas was really never produced. And so now you're looking at some of that. You go into some of these old wells and the oil isn't a problem, but this gas that there's no record of is, or in between the time that well was abandoned, maybe there was a gas storage field put in there that they didn't know about. So now you're getting, gas emissions from another source. So there's understanding that history, understanding, all those details is huge. And even, we're talking about like, I was talking to the Creek tribe last week. I think Tiger is on here from the tribe, and here in Northeast Oklahoma, just like a lot of other places, some of the initial plugging procedures were to plug with brine. So you have these wells that, it has a plugging record, but does that count? And so you go over there and it's bubbling gas up, but it's a plugged well. So does that qualify for these protocols? Mm-hmm. So there's still a lot that we have to ferret out in all of this, but the progress that we've made just now, to date is incredible, I think.
I appreciate you bringing that perspective back in, because yes, right. It sounds like it's a decent list of things to understand better, to bring the integrity that everyone wants to this. Well, the good news is that I've got a lot of questions, some of which we've been tackling. The bad news is that it's actually hard to offer to curate when you've got a lot of questions, I guess. But let me try to tick off at least a couple. So from one member of our group, what percentage of the marginal and idle well operators are small mom and pops, do you think, versus being middle or larger size? Do you have any sense?
That's a tough one to answer. I'm just going to say a considerable number, because I haven't seen a significant thing out specifically specifying that. You got the marginal well commission. There are certainly lots of them, and you also do have say mom and pops. You have small independent operators. You have larger ones. But if you look at, say, the production, the oil and gas production in America, about 85% of the production comes from 15% of the wells. And that other 85%, and I'm being rough numbers here, but that other 85% are marginal producing wells. So these are wells that are producing, less than, say, 10 barrels a day or 15 MCF of gas a day. And that's not to say that some, large independent company may not have some of those, but a lot of those marginal wells are from small operators. And then if you look at that from what they have on their marginal well production to what then they have in a stockpile that is idle and non-producing, it's a multiple. So I don't have an exact answer, but it's a lot.
Understood. And that's okay. It's worth getting the perspective, I think. I don't know how close you are to the demand side here. So the next question is about the demand for the credits. And I'm not sure, but I'll essentially ask it that way. Do you have a feel for what is queuing up on the demand side? In a sense, sort of how the selling process is going for developers? Any context around that for us?
So I would say that's what I've been spending 90% of my time on here most recently. And, some of the challenges that I'll just say that really came into the mix here is the Vera Red Plus Plus program, and the negativity that protocol got, which is a nature-based solution, and the Amazon rainforest type stuff. That really hit the voluntary carbon market. But what I would say is that you have different markets, and what we're seeing is, just in talking to people engaged in this, both here in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, is there are people that believe that the carbon market is ready to take off, that are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into this market. We've talked to groups that are looking at even carbon insetting to address things like RNG and SAF, that not only want these, but the carbon insetting can improve their economics, make their products greener, and they want 10 or 15 or 20-year contracts, so that you work with a project developer and you're going to supply me X number of credits on an annual or quarterly basis. So that I would say that within that realm, the things that I see is people are still trying to understand it. So I can tell you what I'm doing is doing my best to educate people, to help them understand a lot of this better, so that they can distinguish between this and, a soil protocol, or, growing trees, or, all these different things. But I would say across the board, what I'm seeing is demand increasing. I would say a lot of the rates now that people are looking at are probably in that, $5 to $15 range. But believing that in relatively short order that's going to go up. I can tell you that we're talking to several people that have a high degree of interest here, but it's still very early in this, so they don't have things to compare to. So if you're a trader, how do I come up to you, Brad, and say, hey, Brad, I got you this deal here. I can get this only for $24 a ton instead of 25, and like everybody else is doing. I mean, this is so new. I mean, the first protocols are less than a year old.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask if that 5 to 15 range is heavily dependent, if you have the ability to have the perspective, if it's heavily dependent on the fact that your red plus credits were trading at 75 cents or 60 cents not that long ago, right? So the depression in the market, you'd imagine, takes its toll on all forms of credits.
But
perhaps.
I'll tell you, but there's still these kind of credits being sold on a B2B basis for $40 a ton.
Okay, that's good to know.
So I'm just saying there's just we're dealing with a broad spectrum. Everything isn't out, like the New York Stock Exchange where exactly what everything is. There's all these different things, and like I said, we're very close. I think that Greg Wallace and I will have set up to be able to take in credits that have gone through the B carbon registry to be sold on the UN compliance market probably within 2 to 3 months.
Really good to know. Thank you. Let me ask a couple of questions, pivoting back to the issue of additionality and idle wells. Mm-hmm. You mentioned it in your comments, but it drew a couple of questions. I guess one may be a bit, maybe it's just formality, but does the developer have to take ownership of the idle well? Is that a condition in doing the project? That's the first question. And then I guess the second is, I guess the second is a little bit broader. It's how does it meet that additionality threshold? So you talked a bit about the complexity, about the optionality that an idle well has to be redeveloped or reused, repurposed in some way. But how is there something systematic that needs to be brought to the discussion so that you say, yep, this is additional because it would have been, XYZ, something else would have happened. So
the additionality, what was the first question?
So the first one is the easier one, I guess. It's, does the developer have to take ownership of the well?
Okay, I got you. So I would say for idle wells, the developer does not have to take ownership of the well. They can, but what they have to do is they have to take ownership of the environmental attributes for that well. So you can do that with a contract where the operator, still having the well, still holding, those liabilities and so forth, transfers the environmental attributes of the well to the project developer. So we've got a contract that we've utilized and done that with. On additionality, it's it's interesting. So you have to look at the fact that to assure that that a well isn't under a requirement that you've got to go plug this well, Mr. Operator. But um, I would just say that gosh, there's so many examples of why some of this happens. So, for instance, I've got a relative that had some gas wells in West Texas, and he didn't even pursue carbon credits for these, but they were making about 10 or 15 MCF of gas a day. And if you've been paying attention, the Permian Basin is in a water crisis. So we're producing 1 billion barrels of water. We're trying to manage that water, reuse the water, treat it, and recycle, inject it in disposal wells and all these different things, but 1 billion barrels. So part of what's happening to some of the smaller operators in a number of areas is the larger operators have taken over a lot of the capacity at the existing disposal wells. So there's no place to take their water. And so in this case, my uncle he couldn't produce his wells because there wasn't an option for getting the water disposed of. So that's just one issue. But there's so many others that have happened, that we've seen with issues with landowners and leaks and wells that just require maintenance, or you could you're not required, but you've idled a well because it's going to cost you $30,000 to fix it, and the price of gas goes down. I mean, you look at right now, there's a lot of operators that are getting less than $1 in MCF on gas and have just said, I can't do this. They're not required to plug the well, but they can't economically operate it. So you've just got to look at the wells on the idle side of, assuring that it's not under some requirement that it has to be plugged. And ultimately to get in there, you've got to look that it qualifies under the various other things. That makes sense. I could probably talk about additionality all day if you want me.
Understood. No, but the examples are great. I mean, I'm sure there are categories that will get formed over time, but the point is there kind of is still a story, and it is still a well by well evaluation, which of course doesn't, honestly, from my perspective, doesn't feel great, because I want 1 million of these to get done. And so you want as much sort of consistency and, standardization as possible. But I appreciate that's just not where it's at yet. So
some of them may be like a lease by lease or field by field or whatever, that could include a dozen wells or 50 wells or 100 wells or something like that. So
fair point. And I love the comment you made earlier about this teeing up of a multi-year, the pre-funding and the pre-commitment. That's fantastic. Well, look, I guess we've run up past the hour, so it's probably a good time for us to end this. But thank you. That really was a terrific discussion. Again, as I mentioned, for everyone that's still on board here, production video will be coming out shortly so that you can rewatch it or send it around or whatever. Please, if you want to be in touch with Dan, get in touch with him directly. We talk about slides or whatever, talk about more points. He's happy to do that. And otherwise, I thank you all for joining. Dan, I thank you again very much for really, really great commentary. I love it. Really great conversation. And I wish you all a terrific rest of your day.
Thanks for all you do, Brad. Appreciate it.
Take care, everybody.